The BBC has seen evidence of continuing attacks on anti-government protesters by the security forces in Zimbabwe. The country's Human Rights Commission accused soldiers and police of systematic torture. The European Commission has for the first time made clear that a no-deal Brexit would result in a hard border in Ireland. The number of people in work has reached a new high. Rescue teams have found no trace of a plane carrying Cardiff City's new striker Emiliano Sala, which disappeared last night over the English Channel. Patisserie Valerie has collapsed into administration. 70 stores are to close immediately. Also tonight, a breakthrough for Netflix at the Oscars. Soldiers and police in Zimbabwe have been accused of the systematic torture of civilians who've been beaten with batons after being ordered from their homes at night. The country's Human Rights Commission also says police have used brute, excessive and disproportionate force, causing avoidable loss of life. It says its monitors have confirmed that at least 8 people have died during protests sparked by a rise in the price of fuel, and that there have been arbitrary detentions and arrests. Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa has returned to his country to deal with the situation. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding is in Zimbabwe and today witnessed some of the violence himself.
Writhing in agony, one of the latest victims of Zimbabwe's brutal security crackdown.
How many of you were there that they beat?
We found Tatenda on a street here in Harare. He said he and 30 other young men had been rounded up by a group of soldiers at a bus station this afternoon, taken to an isolated spot and assaulted.
And that went on for 2 hours?
Yeah.
All down your back and your legs?
Yeah, especially the government is beating the people.
This seemingly random violence is, in the eyes of many here, actually part of a systematic campaign to crush all opposition to the government. President Emmerson Mnangagwa says that's nonsense. He's back in Zimbabwe now and urging all sides via Twitter to calm down, respect the rule of law and work together to fix a broken economy. But when I asked spokesman Nick Mangwana whether the government now planned to take a gentler approach towards protesters or to water down harsh economic reforms, he was unrepentant.
The government is in total control. The government is pro-people. But when people are attacking police and they are stoning police to death, police have got guns to protect themselves as well. Whenever a policeman is carrying a gun, their life also matters.
But in impoverished neighbourhoods on the edge of Harare, there is little trust or patience in the government and its reforms. Ellen Ngwena's mother, a nursery school teacher, was hit and killed by an army truck when she joined last week's protests against the soaring cost of living.
We'll continue protesting until things settle.
So you're not afraid?
I'm not afraid to protest.
Even though your mother was killed?
I don't care because we are hungry.
Around her, a dozen toddlers. Their parents, by and large, unemployed now, too poor these days to pay the nursery school's modest fees.
The violence in Zimbabwe has raised questions about where power really lies in the country. Our Africa editor Fergal Keane reflects on the continuing strength of the military since the election of President Emmerson Mnangagwa last year.
Zimbabwe represents an economy in freefall and one of the worst examples of political repression in contemporary Africa. The President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, looks as if his control of events is nominal at best, while his deputy, the former army chief, Constantine Chiwenga, wields the real power. He controls the army, which brought Mr Mnangagwa to power after the overthrow of Robert Mugabe in November 2017. The first post-Mugabe election last July was followed by violence, much of it inflicted by the army, and the realisation that a change of leaders didn't mean a change to the system of patronage, corruption and state violence, which has been the hallmark of ZANU-PF for many years. Mr Mnangagwa was steeped in the repression of the past, but was said to be more pragmatic than General Chiwenga, understanding that if foreign investment was to be attracted after Mugabe, the thuggish and venal politics of old would need to be transformed. The President has called for a national dialogue and spoken of heads rolling if members of the security forces were found to have abused their power. It will take concrete action to make Zimbabweans believe he is sincere. The country is hostage to a ruling elite that is bitterly divided and struggling, to put it mildly, to persuade the international community that the country is, in Mr Mnangagwa's phrase, open for business.
The European Commission has said a hard border would have to be created in some form if there's no EU withdrawal agreement with the UK covering trade in Ireland. A spokesman said such an outcome would be pretty obvious. The Irish government has again stressed it doesn't want a hard border, physical checks or infrastructure, but acknowledged it would have to have very difficult discussions with its EU partners in the event of a no-deal Brexit. The Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar said no deal would present Dublin with a real dilemma and suggested Britain and Ireland would have to work out separate arrangements to protect trade and the peace process. Our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly reports.
The bitterly disputed creation of a backstop arrangement for the Irish border has become the great vexed question of the Brexit talks, even though it would only apply after the conclusion of withdrawal agreement, the expiry of a transitional period and a failure to reach a long-term trade deal. Now the European Commission's chief spokesman, Margaritis Schinas, has spelled out, under questioning at a briefing, the awkward prospect for the EU of what might happen much more immediately if the UK were to leave at the end of March with no agreement.
If you like me to push me and speculate on what might happen in a no-deal scenario in Ireland, I think it's pretty obvious. You will have a hard border.
Under a no-deal outcome, the Irish government would become responsible for ensuring that any goods entering the EU from anywhere in the world through the island of Ireland met the standards of the EU's single market. The suggestion in Brussels is that that would mean checks of some kind, presumably at ports like Dublin, for goods being moved to the continent. But speaking in the Irish Parliament, the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar appeared to suggest that what he thought would happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit would be a bilateral arrangement between Ireland and the UK designed to allow both to honour their joint commitment to not reintroduce a hard border.
Both the UK and Ireland will have an obligation to honour the Good Friday Agreement, protect the peace process and honour our commitment to the people of Ireland and Northern Ireland that there won't be a hard border. So what would we have to do in that scenario? We'd have to negotiate an agreement on customs and regulations that meant full alignment, so there would be no hard border.
After long months of solidarity and unity on the European side, there'll be concern in Dublin at any hint from Brussels at the possibility of a hard border in future, especially if the prospect is made more likely by a failure to agree over the backstop, which was created precisely to avoid such an outcome.
In Westminster, MPs from across the political divide have been tabling a series of amendments aimed at persuading the Prime Minister to change her approach to Brexit before a vote next week. With more details, here's our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
24 hours after resurrecting her battered Brexit deal, the Prime Minister is now facing a barrage of critical backbench amendments. So far, 8 separate motions have been tabled designed to force a rethink. These include measures to rule out no deal, call a further referendum and hold a series of indicative votes in Parliament to establish what MPs might support. Labour have also inched a step further towards backing a fresh referendum after announcing they would support plans to allow MPs a vote to trigger one, although Mr Corbyn's aides later insisted this was simply in line with the party's existing policy of keeping open the option of another referendum. Meanwhile, Downing Street sources have rebuffed calls from the Work and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd to allow a free vote on a cross-party move to delay Brexit until the end of the year. The motion, tabled by Labour's Yvette Cooper, has the backing of prominent backbenchers. There have also been suggestions the Prime Minister could face the threat of resignations if she ordered her ministers to oppose the measure. There is, however, one potentially helpful amendment for Mrs May, tabled by the Conservative Andrew Murison, which urges the EU to set an expiry date for the Northern Ireland backstop. What's eventually put to the vote next Tuesday will depend on the Speaker, but it's clear the Prime Minister could be facing another significant revolt against her Brexit deal ahead of the final meaningful vote expected in mid-February.
The Chief Executive of the Civil Service has suggested that a no-deal Brexit will be a a bit bumpy and is unlikely to go swimmingly well. In a separate development, an internal letter sent to staff at the National Crime Agency has warned that significant short-term disruption is likely, with possible food shortages and disruption to transport. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford.
With Brexit less than 10 weeks away, we're starting to get an idea of how the civil service is getting ready for a possible no-deal exit. In December, the Cabinet Secretary told all government departments to make it a priority. This afternoon we learned that if no deal happens, then the government will declare a critical incident and move into a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week operation in command and control mode. Thousands of officials will be moved on to handling the situation. The border force has told staff they can't take holiday from the end of March until at least mid-April. The Chief Executive of the Civil Service, John Manzoni, said it was now significantly better prepared, but it wouldn't be an entirely smooth ride.
I've never pretended that it's all going to go swimmingly well in the event of a no deal, which is just a few days away, or potentially. Will things not be a bit bumpy? Of course they will, in the event that that is the outcome. And I hope that it isn't the outcome.
Both the Department of Health and DEFRA are setting up control centres to handle potential problems with moving food and medicines from Europe. Police expect major disruptions at ports, with the possibility of fuel shortages and even public disorder.
The UK's unemployment rate has dropped to 4%, its lowest level since 1975. The Office for National Statistics says wages, excluding bonuses, rose by 3.3%, although people are still earning less in real terms than they were before the financial crisis. Our economics correspondent, Andy Verity, reports.
The economy created 141,000 new jobs in the 3 months to the end of November, most of them full-time posts. The number in work grew to 32.5 million, with full-time workers reaching a new record of 24 million. The number counted as unemployed was 1.37 million, or 4.0%, the lowest rate in nearly 44 years. Because most of the hiring decisions that created jobs from September to November would have been taken in the summer, the effects of growing Brexit-related uncertainty won't yet have fed through to the figures. What's clear, though, is there are now more vacancies than there have been in nearly 2 decades. In theory, that should boost employees' bargaining power so they can negotiate better wages. The average pay packet grew by 3.3% in the year to the end of November to reach £494 a week. After taking inflation into account, that's about £25 more than it was in 2014. But it's still about £20 less than it was at the pre-crisis peak in 2007.
Cardiff City Football Club have expressed their shock at the disappearance of a light aircraft carrying their newest signing. French civil aviation officials confirmed that the Argentine striker Emiliano Sala was one of the 2 people aboard the plane which lost contact with air traffic controllers near Guernsey last night. Sala joined the Premier League club for a record fee on Saturday and was due to take part in his first training session there. Our correspondent John Kay reports from the Cardiff City Stadium.
Just 3 days after signing for Cardiff City, Emiliano Sala was due to start at the club today. But instead his new teammates have been waiting for news. The private Piper Malibu aircraft on which he was being flown to Cardiff from Nantes lost contact off Alderney in the Channel Islands at around 8 o'clock last night. The club's chief executive Ken Chu, who signed the striker, said it was a worrying time.
He was so happy to join Cardiff City. We have a lot of fans and supporters who is very concerned, and we can understand their concern, and we are too.
With sea temperatures low and weather conditions poor, tonight a spokesman for the Channel Islands Air Search said the probability of finding anyone alive from the missing aircraft was reducing very rapidly. Captain David Barker is harbour master for the States of Guernsey.
We've now searched over 1,000 square miles of sea using assets from the UK and from France alongside our own Channel Islands search assets.
Emiliano Sala, who's 28, was the only passenger on board the plane. The pilot has not been named. Guernsey police said tonight that some items had been spotted floating in the sea, but search teams were unable to confirm that they'd come from the missing plane. The rescue operation has now been suspended until sunrise tomorrow.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far. Security forces in Zimbabwe have continued to carry out attacks on anti-government protesters, despite assurances from President Mnangagwa that he would investigate any misconduct. The European Commission has confirmed that a no-deal Brexit would result in a hard border in Ireland. Still to come?
I am not a hotel room. I am home. I am not the whiskey you want. I am the water you need. So don't come here with expectations and try to make a vacation out of me.
The new voices driving poetry to a wider audience. The cake shop chain Patisserie Valerie has called in administrators who are to close 70 branches immediately with significant job losses. The company has been struggling to survive since massive holes were found in its accounts in October. Today it announced that talks with its bankers had failed and it cannot renew its bank loans. Our business correspondent John T. Bloom reports.
Patisserie Valerie was for years a single cake shop in central London, but in 2006 it was bought by the serial entrepreneur Luke Johnson and expanded rapidly. It now has more than 206 shops and cafes across the UK, but in October the company's shares were suspended after it discovered huge and potentially fraudulent accounting irregularities. Mr Johnson saved the company from immediate collapse by lending it £10 million, but that's not been enough, and Patisserie Valerie has now appointed KPMG as its administrators. They've announced that they will keep 121 profitable stores open, but 70 will close immediately, with a significant number of redundancies. The company's bankers and shareholders are likely to lose most of their money, and more than 3,000 jobs in total are now at risk. Luke Johnson has personally extended a loan to pay January's wage bill. As a major shareholder, he will quite possibly lose a large portion of his £220 million fortune. More widely, the collapse will once again raise very serious questions about auditors who failed to spot huge black holes in businesses' accounts shortly before their collapse.
The Criminal Bar Association says chaos is being caused in the court system because of multiple IT failures. They say trials are having to be adjourned because it's not possible to access information held digitally. The Ministry of Justice has apologised for the failures. Our legal correspondent Clive Coleman reports.
Yesterday at Birmingham Crown Court, a major centre trying serious crimes, the recording system broke down, meaning that, as a court of record, proceedings had to be abandoned. The system, which lists cases and informs all involved where to go and when, is failing intermittently across England. One barrister described it as being like an air traffic failure, placing lawyers rather than pilots in the wrong place and unable to do their jobs. There have been problems with secure emails by which lawyers, the Crown Prosecution Service, judges, probation and the courts communicate with each other. And lawyers can't access videoed interviews with vulnerable witnesses or vital documents because court networks are down. Kate Becks QC is a criminal barrister.
When we look at the faces of jurors in courts and they look at us with dismay when we can't get a simple video to work, when the issues are so important, when people's lives are at stake. And so the effect it's having is inevitable. It diminishes the standing of the criminal justice system.
The Criminal Bar Association says the system is on its knees and that ministers were warned that digitisation of the courts was unrealistic and too driven by cost savings. The Ministry of Justice has apologised, says contingency plans are in place and is pressing its suppliers to provide urgent solutions so services can return to normal as soon as possible.
A court's been told that a man planned an acid attack against his 3-year-old son to try to discredit his estranged wife in a custody battle. The 40-year-old, who can't be identified, and 6 others have denied being part of a plot to injure the boy, who has made a good recovery from his injuries. Phil Mackey reports from Worcester Crown Court.
The child suffered burns to his arm and forehead after he was squirted with sulphuric acid during a shopping trip with his mother, brother and sister in Worcester city centre last July. It's alleged the attack was planned by the boy's father, who it's claimed was angry that his wife had left him and taken the children with her. Opening the case for the prosecution, Jonathan Rees QC told jurors it was a cowardly attack on a defenceless child. Mr Rees said the father had hired a private investigator to follow his wife and also told authorities that she was mistreating the children. Prosecutors believe the man intended to use the boy's injuries to discredit the mother in the forthcoming custody battle. The court heard that two of the father's friends, who like him were Afghan nationals, had acted as middlemen in arranging for 4 others to attack the child. Jurors were told that there had been an aborted attack outside a primary school 8 days earlier. All 7 defendants deny a charge of conspiracy to apply a corrosive fluid with intent. The trial is expected to last 7 weeks.
The Scottish Government has ordered an investigation into the construction and design of Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow after the deaths of 2 patients who contracted a rare infection linked to pigeon droppings. A post-mortem examination confirmed that one of the patients, a child, died as a direct result of the infection. A father has said he believes social media played a major part in the death of his 14-year-old daughter, who found information about suicide and self-harm on Instagram. A coroner has begun considering the case of Molly Russell, who took her own life in 2017. Earlier today, the government called on tech companies to identify young people at risk, block harmful content and offer them support. Angus Crawford reports.
Each year in the UK, 200 young people take their own lives. And while rates of suicide for most groups in society are static or falling, there's been a rise in the number of those under 18 who kill themselves. It's a complex picture, but there is increasing concern that access to harmful content online may be a factor. A coroner today heard submissions in the case of Molly Russell from North London. She was 14 when she took her own life 2 years ago. Her father, Ian, believes her use of the social media app Instagram played a significant part. Without her parents' knowledge, she'd been looking at graphic posts, images and videos about self-harm and suicide.
We didn't know that anything like that could possibly exist on a platform like Instagram. We maybe would have thought that that would have been in some corner of the web that was inaccessible, but this is absolutely publicly, openly available, and they're still there.
The suicide prevention charity Papyrus, which focuses on children, is worried the algorithms behind social media platforms can push increasing amounts of harmful material to vulnerable people. Jed Flynn, who's the charity's chief executive, believes Instagram in particular needs to change.
Take this seriously. Suicide is the leading cause of death in children. How bad does it need to get? I would say they need to look long and hard about changing their algorithms to save lives, and do it now.
Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, refused our request for an interview, but says it consults with experts worldwide on these issues and does remove harmful content.
One of the last 2 surviving dam busters, the Canadian air gunner Fred Sutherland, has died. He was in his 90s. Fred Sutherland was 20 when his crew used a new type of bouncing bomb to attack the Ada Dam in May 1943. And it was the bomb dropped by his aircraft which finally destroyed the target. The technology firm Dyson has announced plans to move its head office from Wiltshire to Singapore. The company's chief executive said the move from Malmesbury to the Far East had nothing to do with Brexit or tax, but was needed because all of its manufacturing and most of its customers were now in Asia. The news came as Dyson revealed it made profits of £1.1 billion last year, a 33% increase on the previous year. Here's our business correspondent, Theo Leggett.
Dyson's chief executive Jim Rowan said today he would describe the business as a global technology company. However, because its roots are in Britain and its founder, Sir James Dyson, has been a vocal supporter of Brexit, the decision to move its headquarters to Singapore is likely to make political waves. In practical terms, the change is a minor one. 2 senior executives will be transferred to the Singapore office, where the company itself will now be registered. There'll be no impact on its 4,000 workers in Britain, and according to Mr. Rowan, little impact on its tax affairs either. In 2017, it paid £95 million to the Exchequer. It'll continue to invest in its UK research and engineering sites in Malmesbury, London and Bristol, as well as a new centre in Hallavington, where it plans to develop a groundbreaking electric car. But the change is still highly symbolic. Dyson has made it clear its centre of gravity now lies in Asia, where it sees the biggest opportunities for growth. There may be business logic in the move, but as the UK struggles to define a coherent vision for its own future, it's unlikely to be applauded here.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day down 69 points at 6,901. In New York, a short time ago, the Dow Jones was down 287 at 24,419. On the currency markets, the pound was up half a cent at $1.29.5. And against the euro, the pound was up half a cent at €1.14, and that makes a euro worth 87.7 pence. Sales of poetry hit a record high last year, with 1.3 million volumes being sold in the UK. It's part of a growing trend, up 50% in 6 years. Millennials and teenagers make up a large part of the audience. A 26-year-old Canadian, Rupi Kaur, is a superstar in the genre. She publishes her free verse on social media, reaching vast audiences and tackling hard-hitting subjects such as abuse and racism, as well as love, sex and the meaning of beauty. Our arts correspondent, David Silito, considers why more people are turning to poetry.
I am not street meat, I am homemade jam, thick enough to cut, the sweetest things your lips will touch. I'm not...
Just over 4 years ago, Rupi Kaur published her first collection of poems. In the world of poetry, 10,000 copies would have made her a bestseller. So far, she's sold, around the world, more than 2 million. And one of the reasons she's reached such a wide audience is Instagram. What began as a means of sharing pictures has become a place to share meaningful words. Andre Breed of the company Nielsen, which tracks book sales, says it's helped drive 6 years of growth in what used to be a small and almost static market.
I think one of the factors is definitely how social media is really well suited for spreading poetry, reading poetry, listening to poetry. So poetry has historically been a relatively stable market at about £8 million of books, and it is now over 12 million.
This is the place in the northwest of England. It's ace, it's the best, and the songs that we sing from the stands from our band set the whole...
When Tony Walsh read out his poem This Is the Place in the aftermath of the Manchester bomb attack, his total sales doubled in a week. In a culture awash with online words, a well-written line has a new power, especially at difficult moments. When the MP Joe Cox was murdered, the Poetry Society shared Philip Larkin's The Mower. The first day after a death, the new absence is always the same. We should be careful of each other. We should be kind while there is still time. Thousands shared it within a few hours. A 50% rise in sales in 6 years is, in the world of poetry, big news.
The period comedy drama The Favourite and the black and white film Roma lead the contenders for this year's Academy Awards, with 10 nominations each. The star of The Favourite, Olivia Colman, and her co-star Rachel Weisz are among the British nominees. The inclusion of Roma, which was made by Netflix, marks the first time the online streaming service has been recognised in the Best Picture category. Our arts editor Will Gompertz reports.
This year's Oscar nominations are something of a curate's egg. On the one hand, they could be described as diverse. After all, there are 2 films, Green Book and Black Klansman, examining racism in America. There is another, Black Panther, the first superhero film to receive a nomination, celebrating black culture. While The Favourite, a darkly comic depiction of Queen Anne's 18th century court, is an unapologetic portrayal of a lesbian love triangle.
I'm ready for the Russian ambassador.
Who did your makeup?
We went for something dramatic. Do you like it?
You look like a badger. Oh. Are you going to cry? Really? Well, what do you think you look like? Badger.
On the other hand, it could be considered a largely conservative list. There is, for example, only 1 black actor and 1 black actress among the 20 acting nominations. And there are no women listed in the Best Director category or for cinematography. There is, though, bound to be controversy, not least with the nomination of Detainment in the Best Live-Action Short category, which is about the brutal murder of 2-year-old James Bulger in Liverpool in 1993. Both his parents have spoken out against it. And then there's Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, a Spanish-language film about the director's childhood in Mexico, which is shortlisted for Best Film. To the dismay of some cinema owners, it gives streaming service Netflix its first nomination. It might well win, which will give Cuarón the opportunity to make further public comments about President Trump's proposed wall along the border between Mexico and America. There is no real standout favourite this year, which might work out well for The Favourite.
The headlines again. Zimbabwe's army and police have been accused by the country's Human Rights Commission of systematically torturing civilians and using excessive force to quell protests. The Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar has said a no-deal Brexit would present a real dilemma for Dublin, and he suggested the UK and Ireland might have to hold talks on customs and regulations to ensure there was no hard border. Unemployment has fallen to its lowest level since 1975 at 4%. It's been confirmed that Cardiff City Football Club's new record signing, Emiliano Sala, was on board a light aircraft which disappeared last night near Guernsey. The cafe chain Patisserie Valerie has called in administrators who are closing 70 branches. BBC News.